Will voters forget their anger over Labor's tax changes now they've been passed into law? The Treasurer thinks so. Or will this budget deliver a slow burn all the way to the election? Jim Chalmers is our guest this morning. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. It was an important victory for Labor. After just 6 weeks, the budget and its changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax in particular are now law. The Greens secured only minor concessions. The government's relieved to have this done so quickly. And the icing on the cake, the opposition leader found himself muddled on multiculturalism, unable to clearly state where he stood. Angus Taylor can't afford many missteps, and this one rattled already nervous Liberal MPs. But the coalition is holding on to hope the fight over tax changes won't be forgotten quickly.
The matter is resolved in the affirmative.
Our legislation has just passed the Senate.
Yeah! The Prime Minister said, I don't negotiate with the Greens. When will you stop lying?
We have a Senate that we have to deal with, and that is precisely what we're doing.
I love it. How can you miss that? Stop Labor, fire the liar.
I mean, everyone wants to fire the liar, but what we've really got to do is drop the flop.
It's flipped and flopped and flipped and flopped.
And that's the difference between this side of the House and the three right-wing parties.
This House censures the Prime Minister for his budget of broken promises and toxic taxes. Betrayal.
If anyone yells and screams, they're not going to stay here. No Australian wants to see that.
This mob is made up of idiots.
This country needs to wake the f*** up.
Let me tell you, we are here and we are ready to replace them.
When did the Minister first become aware that the government's changes to capital gains tax and negative gearing imposed the new death tax on widows, divorcees and victims of domestic violence?
It will come back in the second tranche of legislation.
The next tranche, there's more. Oh my God, there's more.
Don't get run over. That's what the boss is off.
Axe these toxic taxes.
Tax reform is always hard.
Houses will fall by between 3 and 7%.
A bleak outlook for those looking to sell in the next year.
We see periods of very significant house price growth and then we see the market make a correction, and that's what we're seeing at the moment.
We're not. A correction is a 10% drop in prices.
Well, I think the Housing Minister was using a general description rather than a technical definition.
Is this what you wanted, for people to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars on their property?
No, well, you're exaggerating what's happening. Now that these changes have occurred, some of the nonsense that's out there will dissipate.
What do you find exciting about it? Or have you learnt anything?
Property markets are crashing. We have the highest inflation rate in the developed world. We have interest rates going up.
New data confirmed underlying inflation still creeping higher.
Today's numbers are much better than what the market expected and better than forecast.
We have debt petrol continuing to be poured on the inflation fire.
Nothing darkens their mood like another fall in inflation.
Frankly, you need a breathalyser.
Well, again, Tim,
this is the problem we now have. Hang on, I wasn't finished, Pat. Calm down, Pat. Calm down. I was saying something.
Wake the f*** up.
Idiots.
Betrayal.
The Leader of the House.
All going on. We're joined this week by Laura Tingle, the ABC's Global Affairs Editor, Phil Coorey, Political Editor of the Australian Financial Review, and Anna Henderson, Chief Political Correspondent for SBS. Very good morning to all of you. Hi. Laura, you've seen various governments attempt various versions of tax reform over the years. Looking at this one, was this a model of good process, or was this a rushed effort for political reasons?
Tick, tick. It was both of those things, I think, David. But I suppose the thing that struck me looking at it is the changing nature of the parliament and of politics. The 1990s tax deal by John Howard was basically 3 years in the making, and the way the news cycle works, the absolute sort of antagonistic approach of politics means that I just don't think there's that much scope to do that. So it's rough and ready, but these are really important changes, really significant changes, sloppy around the edges, but that's probably just the way you've got to do it.
You're saying the nature of the political climate now is you've got to do things that quickly?
I think so, yeah. I mean, can you imagine having a debate for 3 years about this? We've been having a debate about these issues for 3 years, for years and years, and it's never got anywhere. So I think the government's just sort of seen an opportunity, and it's in like Flynn.
Phil, I suspect you're a little less
Yeah,
forgiving.
I tend to disagree. Yeah, at the end of the day, they had to get a tax rise through the Senate with the Greens. That's not hard. That's the equivalent of pushing on an open door. Laura is right, and some of these things have been discussed for years, but that's with relation to housing. The imposition of an inflation-based CGT model on business and shares wasn't discussed at all in the lead up to the election or the budget, especially one with no income averaging or a 30% floor. People were understandably anxious about it. There was no rationale to get it through the Parliament this fortnight. These measures don't start for another year. Actually, the NDIS bill was the one that was time urgent, and we saw it throughout the week. We saw the government was fixing the plane as it was flying. They made 6 major concessions in a week, including just some overnight deal with the Greens about self-managed funds, not being able to use low borrowing loans to to buy a house, a residential property, and then we saw if it weren't for David Pocock at the 11th hour on the very day they were going to pass the bill, highlighting this issue of a widow's tax, which is you would lose your exemptions from negative gearing if in the extent of a divorce or a death and a partial transfer of ownership. I mean, it was far from ideal process for policy making, and as the Treasurer will say, that will be all mopped up in the second tranche of bills, which is the sort of clean up on aisle 9 bill. That's the one that also will look after the the unforeseen circumstances for startups and others with low capital bases that it's hard to apply this inflation model to. So I think they could have taken another couple of months and done this more smoothly without the anxiety and backflips and all those sorts of things, and they chose not to because they want to get it off the agenda.
Yeah, and what do you think? I mean, clearly, politically, it's better for the government to have this done and dusted as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Get it out of the headlines, get the kind of substantive elements through, send out that message that the government is dealing with intergenerational inequality, that it hears the concerns of the young, growing voter base and is trying to make it easier for them. It hasn't been an easy run for them. There have been a number, as Phil has just outlined, of things that have happened at the last minute that have kind of fine print potentially for a lot of people who aren't directly affected, but it looks messy. And the underlying reality that these are major broken promises from the election, handing campaign tactics to their opponents.
Now having passed the Parliament changes the equation a little bit for the coalition. They're committed to restoring negative gearing across the board and the old capital gains tax rules. Will that become a little more difficult for them now to undo what's been done?
It feels like it will be, because we've got this time that will elapse before we're at an election period and people might get comfortable with it. And there is a strong view within Labor that people will get comfortable with it and see the value of it. But at the same time, how many other unintended consequences might be raised by another politician or interest group that sees there's an issue here? Can the clean up in aisle 9 bill deal with all of that? Or does it make it look even more messy when that gets to the Parliament?
Yeah, what do you think, Phil?
Oh, look, it's neither here nor there. The coalition, well, they've got to win the next election and control the Senate, both, long shots, but let's assume they do. There's the risk of rollback. Remember, Kim Beazley thought it was a great idea to roll back the GST and it turned into a disaster for him. This budget is not all unpopular. The housing stuff, it appears to be very popular. If I look on social media and speaking anecdotally, because the argument for housing had been made, at least on CGT, getting the investors out of auctions is very popular. I mean, the government got in the sticky paper this week. Secretly, they're happy prices are falling because that's what's meant to happen, but they don't want to take responsibility for it because you don't want to be talking down someone's asset, but that's what it's meant to do. People trying to get into the market like this. So I would suspect that if the opposition ever got into a position to be able to make a meaningful policy, they would probably say, oh, we're just going to leave it on housing and take it off business.
Maybe. I mean, that's not what they're saying.
They could take a nuanced approach to the next.
No, at the moment they're saying that.
Because they tell me now, if you talk to the Libs now, they sort of said if this budget had just been focused on housing, they would have just sort of mildly complained and waved it through. That would have put them in a different
But it's
position.
the impact.
Yeah, the anger we talk about is not about the housing stuff. So it is a little bit, but it's more about...
Well, there was a poll, I think a Resolve poll earlier in the week too, Laura, that had pretty solid support for house prices falling. I know governments are always reluctant to say whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that prices come down, because there are winners and there are losers. But there was a poll showing more than 50%, and across all demographics, I think, that are happy with prices coming down.
Prices coming down, and I think probably a lot of people sort of basically say, as Phil says, the housing stuff is overdue and to be done with. But, at that really big optics level, I think the real issue for people who aren't paying attention to politics, particularly at the moment, which is most people, the only thing that really cuts through is, oh, he's broken a promise. Now, the only thing I would say about that is, if you're Labor, you just go for it and just, I was overseas, but I saw the Prime Minister in an interview and he was still squibbling about this. Just go and say, yeah, we did. Yeah, we did. And the reason we did is because we had to do these things and these were the reasons why we weren't saying it at the election. Just go for it. I mean, they should have learnt that from the stage 3 tax cuts. That
radical honesty. Yeah.
Well, if you're going to do it, just make the most of it and sort of show that you're dynamic, show that you're actually doing stuff.
Yep. All right. Well, time to talk to the Treasurer. And the speed with which these tax changes were whisked through the Parliament was criticised by his opposite number.
It has continued to unravel faster than the Prime Minister can say 50 times over, I won't introduce these new taxes. What we've seen now is higher taxes on property. They've had to back down on CGT changes for small businesses. They've now got a widow's tax, which this morning we had Labor government ministers going out and defending. By about 1 o'clock this afternoon, the Prime Minister humiliated the Treasurer again and has now been forced into repealing their position.
Jim Chalmers, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, David.
So the Howard government had more than 10 months and an election between announcing their tax reforms and a vote in Parliament. You had just 6 weeks. Why the rush?
Well, we're very grateful for the support of the Parliament, David, because it means that we're cutting taxes for workers, we're making it easier for first home buyers, and we're making the tax system fairer as well. This is how we deliver cost of living relief and deliver real change in the tax system. It's not unusual for the core elements of big tax reforms to be legislated first and then for there to be subsequent consultation and other pieces of legislation. That's what we've seen in those other episodes of tax reform in this country, and that's what we're seeing now.
Yeah, but the question was about the speed here. These tax changes don't take effect for another 12 months. Why did you have to do this so quickly?
Well, our objective here was to provide certainty for investors and others about the core elements of this tax package. And whenever tax reform is undertaken in this country, it's hotly contested, it's contentious. There are all kinds of predictions that the sky will fall in and all other kinds of predictions which turn out to be wrong. We expect that to be the case again. But we've legislated the core elements quickly because we want to provide that level of certainty. We're engaged in that consultation. There will, as there always has been in tax reform, be subsequent pieces of legislation as well to nail down some of the final implementation details and next steps.
You talk about certainty, but with that haste comes the risk of unintended consequences. And one of those was this issue of negatively geared properties that are jointly held when a couple divorce or a partner dies. It's been dubbed the widow tax. What is going to happen there?
Well, we've made it clear that we'll address that in subsequent pieces of implementation legislation. Again, not especially unusual when it comes to tax reform for those sorts of details to be settled subsequent to the core elements. That issue has come up before. It came up, for example, in the Senate inquiry. We have been working through it to make sure that we can address it properly. In the interim, we were describing the arrangements as they stand. Now, when the amendments were put before the Senate, we had to make clear that we were working through that issue and we intend to address it in subsequent pieces of legislation, and that's the case.
Are you suggesting you were aware of this issue before? David Pocock raised it in the last few days?
Well, it came up in the Senate inquiry the week before, for example. It has been an issue that has been raised with us. And what we do when issues are raised with us, we work through them in a pragmatic way, in a sensible way. And when the Senate amendments, when it became necessary for us to declare our position on those Senate amendments, which is not to vote for them in the form that David Pocock put them forward, but to work through them in a methodical way for subsequent pieces of legislation, we made it very clear that that's what we intend to do.
So what does that mean? What are you actually going to do?
Well, we'll make that clear with the pieces of legislation that follow.
So you're not sure at the moment whether, if someone dies, will the widow or widower be able to keep negatively gearing the property or not?
We've made it really clear we're going to address that concern that people have raised with us.
How is what I'm asking.
Well, I don't want to preempt the outcome, but in saying that we're going to address it, David, I think we're making it incredibly clear that we understand that this is an issue that has been raised with us.
Well,
we intend to address it.
It's not incredibly clear what you'll do. If someone next week loses their partner and they have to rearrange their affairs, can they keep negatively gearing the property?
It is clear that we intend to address that issue. The current tax system has arrangements which say that that is an acquisition. That's how it applies, consistent with other parts of the tax system. But we've said we're going to change that. We've said we're going to address that. Kayleigh Gallagher made it clear, Claire O'Neill made it clear, I made it clear in the course of that Senate debate that it will be addressed.
But do you understand, for people watching this, they hear you say you'll address it, but they don't hear you say how?
Well, that's because it'll be made clear in the legislation, David. Okay. I don't think that's a particularly contentious way to say it. We will address it. If you want to use a different word, David, we will fix it and we'll make clear the way that we will fix it in the legislation that follows. Again, that's not unusual when it comes to tax reform for it to be undertaken in that way.
But someone in this situation next week, the week after, until you address it, should they keep negatively gearing, or under the law do they now have to stop negatively gearing?
Well, nobody has to stop negatively gearing until the 1st of July 2027, and I'm not going to provide advice to individuals, but I can say to your viewers, David, as I've said probably half a dozen times already in this interview, but also in the course of the last week, we will address that issue and we'll make it very clear how.
Look, you also extended concessions to more small business when it comes to capital gains tax. Some will be better off as a result, but will some small business still be worse off under these changes?
Well, every single one of the active small businesses will now have access to generous carve-outs and concessions in the CGT system because we're taking the turnover threshold from $2 million to $10 million. So at the very least, every business between $2 and $10 million turnover will be better off. For all of the others, it depends on the inflation rate. It depends on the marginal tax rate of the person who owns the small business. Some will be better off. For example, in periods of higher inflation, the inflation measure will be more helpful to them. But every single one of them will have access to carve-outs and concessions, every active small business, and that's because we have lifted that threshold. Now, I see some comparisons out there that you're probably referencing in your question, David, and what those comparisons fail to recognise, first of all, our turnover threshold is 10 million. Our opponents say that they'll repeal that legislation, so that's not an accurate comparison.
Well, they have said, just to be clear for people, they have said they would extend that to a $10 million definition as well now, but anyway.
They assume that the business will be held for a period of 1 year. Most businesses are held for longer than that. They make assumptions about the marginal rate of the person. They don't even include, for example, the fact that there's $4 billion worth of small business tax cuts in the budget. So those comparisons from the three right-wing parties are not credible comparisons. We've made very, very sure that every single one of the active small businesses in our country can access generous carve-outs and concessions in the CGT system.
On the housing market, property prices have dipped in Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra. It's good news for those trying to enter the market, worrying news for others. Is there a point at which you would be concerned prices have come down too far? Would a 10% fall be a concern to you?
Look, we're not targeting a particular price or a particular percentage. You're right to say that there has been a softening in the market overall, but not uniformly. There are a whole range of factors which go into house prices and auction clearance rates, interest rates, broader economic conditions, as well as tax settings. We've seen house prices already begin to soften before the budget, and the same is true of auction clearance rates. And so a whole bunch of factors, but also not one homogenous market. You know, I was looking, for example, on the way here, David, at auction clearance rates yesterday, preliminary numbers for yesterday compared to the preliminary numbers for last weekend. Brisbane was up a bit, Sydney was steady, Melbourne was down a little bit, and so different markets are behaving in different ways. We're not aiming for a particular aggregate outcome in price or percentage. The Treasury assumes that house prices will continue to grow in aggregate over the next couple of years, but a bit more slowly than otherwise.
But is there, I mean, any size drop that you honestly would start to think that's a bit of a worry if it goes down too far?
Well, it's best not to overreact to data from a week or two or even a month or two. We've seen a softening in house prices already for all of the reasons that I've run through. It can be volatile. We saw in 2022, for example, a softening in house prices because interest rates started to go up. So it's not especially unusual to see that sort of volatility in different markets. The Treasury assumes that prices will continue to grow, but a bit more slowly. And we see no reason at this point to change those assumptions.
You mentioned interest rates is a big factor when it comes to the housing market. I want to ask you about inflation because it affects interest rates and everything else. The budget forecast headline inflation would peak at 5% this year. Do you still think inflation will peak at 5%?
Well, fighting inflation was a big focus of the budget, and we've made more progress on that front than we expected even at budget time, less than 2 months ago. So the budget forecast for inflation around the middle of the year, as you rightly point out, was for 5% headline inflation. We are making more progress than that, getting inflation down, and so we now expect inflation around the middle of the year to be more like 4.25% rather than 5%. That is very, very welcome progress. It does show, I think it does illustrate the progress that we're making together in this fight against inflation. Now, there's still a lot of uncertainty in the Middle East and elsewhere. There's still more inflation than we would like in our economy as a consequence, but we are making more progress than we anticipated. And for that reason, we expect now that around the middle of the year inflation will be closer to 4.25% than to 5%.
Well, that's interesting and quite a difference in the space of just 6 weeks since the budget. I assume that's also because of conditions in the Strait of Hormuz that you're confident more ships will be able to pass through?
We desperately need the ceasefire to stick. We can't have another false dawn when it comes to the Middle East and particularly the Strait of Hormuz. There have been some really welcome developments on this front, and we've seen the oil price come down quite substantially as a consequence. It wasn't that long ago that a barrel of oil was in the 120s. This morning when I looked, it was in the low 70s. So that's welcome progress. There's inflationary pressures elsewhere in the economy still as well. But if you look at the progress we made on inflation during the week, the welcome developments in the Middle East and a number of other factors, what we actually saw through the course of the last week is that the market expectations for an interest rate hike actually went substantially down. Didn't read that in the media, but that's what the market is expecting because of this progress on inflation, because of these welcome developments in the world. What we saw through the course of the week is that market expectations for interest rate hikes went down, whether it's about the next meeting in August or by the end of the year. Obviously, I don't predict or preempt those developments, but you can see the market reacting.
But you're watching that market
to
reaction,
this progress that we're making on inflation.
We know the Reserve Bank looks more closely at underlying inflation, and it actually went up during the week from 3.4 to 3.6%. Are you changing your forecast at all on underlying inflation?
We'll update those forecasts in the usual way in the mid-year update, but even when it comes to underlying inflation, we're ahead of schedule there as well. I think a number of the private banks have made the point through the course of the week that we're making better than expected progress on underlying inflation as well. That has been coming in a little bit lower than some have anticipated.
But what's Treasury telling you? If Treasury are now telling you the headline forecast has come down to 4.25, are they telling you what they reckon will happen with underlying?
They forecast it in a slightly different way. They strip out the core elements, but Treasury would be seeing what the private banks are seeing, which is that progress on inflation across the board, we're going a bit better than was anticipated. That's obviously a very welcome development, which reflects the progress that we're making on inflation and the welcome developments in the Middle East that we desperately need to hold because Australians have been paying too hefty a price already for this war in the Middle East.
Just a few other issues, Treasurer. You've committed another $3.8 billion in the budget to the suburban rail loop project in Victoria. The Age is reporting some fresh evidence that the Victorian government knew about CFMEU demands to employ far more workers than were necessary on big build projects. They did nothing about it. Are you worried about these reports?
We have absolutely zero tolerance for corruption or criminal behaviour of any kind. We've taken very harsh steps when it comes to the CFMEU, putting it into administration. In fact, that's one of the reasons why these allegations are coming to light, because we took that decisive action. Obviously, when it comes to Commonwealth funding, we insist on the highest standards. And Minister Catherine King, for example, puts obligations on state and territory governments to report any of this behaviour, any behaviour of this kind. It's one of the many ways that we ensure value for money when it comes to these big Commonwealth-funded projects.
But if that Victorian government that you're relying on for that information knows things that it's not making public, does that concern you that they're not perhaps taking the same zero tolerance approach?
Oh, look, from our point of view, I know that we insist on those obligations. We insist on that reporting. As I understand it, Minister King reminds the states and territories of those obligations from time to time. But we have zero tolerance for it. We insist on the highest standards and we insist on value for money for these big, important projects, whether it be in Victoria or in other parts of the country.
On social media, the government's getting tougher today on the social media giants, and I understand you'll be seeking to pass legislation in the coming week, doubling the fines for breaches of the under-16s age restriction and giving the E-Safety Commissioner new powers to compel information from the tech giants. Is this an acknowledgement that the current system hasn't been doing the job?
Oh, we're leading the world when it comes to protecting our kids online, and we're making really important progress, but we will do more because the big tech companies aren't doing enough. We will strengthen the penalties, we will strengthen the powers of the E-Safety Commissioner, and that's because we recognise that the future of our kids, the safety of our kids, is too important to let the big tech companies wriggle off the hook or avoid their responsibilities. So we will do more because the tech companies aren't doing enough, and we'll see that reflected in the Parliament before long.
And finally, Jim Chalmers, I'm keen to hear what you think of what's been happening in British Labour. In the UK Labour Party, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is stepping down. A northerner, Andy Burnham, who's regarded as a stronger communicator, is set to take over. What lessons do you take from this?
Well, I think what we're seeing in the UK is a bit like what we're seeing right around the world. You know, the pace of change is accelerating, the global and generational pressures are intensifying, and people have got legitimate concerns about where they fit in that. And then we've got the anger industry and parties of the populist right trying to make that worse rather than trying to make that better. And so it is a difficult time around the world to be an incumbent government. From our point of view, we are using the power of incumbency to take real action, to deliver cost of living help, to deliver real change. The best antidote to anger is action. And that's the approach that we are taking in delivering this real change, whether it be in the housing market or in the tax system or otherwise. And so what we're seeing in the UK, I think, reflects a broader global trend around incumbency and around the legitimate concerns that people have. The Albanese Labor government has chosen to address those concerns rather than dismiss them. The three right-wing parties in our parliament, with their divisive anti-worker, anti-housing agenda, would make those pressures worse rather than better. We seek to address them and to alleviate them because we recognise that people do have these legitimate concerns, not just in Australia but around the world and including in the UK.
So is the lesson, if you keep taking action as a government, you don't need to resort to the emergency scenario having to refresh the leadership?
I think there's something more fundamental happening here, which is that people understand, as we understand in our government, that the status quo is not working for people, particularly in the economy, but in our societies more broadly. And once you come to that conclusion, once you acknowledge what I think is a fact, then you've got two choices: to try and capitalise on it, as the three right-wing parties are trying to do in Australia, or try to address it, as we are doing. And sometimes when you're addressing this broken status quo, in our case in the housing market, in the tax system, it's hotly contested, it's contentious, it involves some level of political risk, but it's worth it. Because these legitimate concerns that people have, they're not made up, they're not pretend. You know, change is accelerating in our society and in our economy. These global and generational pressures are intensifying on people. And from our point of view, we've chosen to address that, to deliver real change rather than to dismiss it or ignore it.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
Well, coming up, mono versus multiculturalism, how the battle over Australia's soul tore through Canberra. First, let's get back to our panel. We're joined once more by the ABC's Laura Tingle, Philip Coorey from the Australian Financial Review and Anna Henderson from SBS. Laura, just to pick up on what he was talking about at the end there, the Treasurer, the comparison with what's been going on in British Labor. Is Jim Chalmers right to point to, the level of activity is the way to deal with the sort of anger that's out there?
Well, yes and no. I think the interesting thing about Keir Starmer's decline and fall is that it wasn't caused by reform, which of course is the thing that's rather exercising everybody's mind, the idea that Nigel Farage might be the next Prime Minister, bar the current next one. I think that he's right to say that you've got to be out there doing stuff and you've got to be seen to be doing stuff. Keir Starmer basically fell apart from the... well, there are two reasons. One of them is the perception was that they weren't doing anything, and then there was all this sort of scandal and things. And that goes to the double-edged anger that people feel about politics these days, which is basically that either they're corrupt or they're useless, the system doesn't deliver, and that they're not doing anything, which would bring me back to my earlier point, David, about it's one thing to be doing stuff, as Jim Chalmers says he's doing. It's another one to actually be going around and slapping people around the head about it and being out there. And, Labor's strategy until now has been very much driven by the fact it felt penned in on the right and the left. Well, I think they've got to stop worrying about the left. They've got to concentrate on a much straighter contest with people making sort of fairly outlandish claims. Yeah, and that partly involves being able to say, we've broken our promises, yes, you don't like that, we know that, but we are going to make changes and this is why we're going to do it.
Just back on what we heard from the Treasurer, Phil, from Jim Chalmers on inflation, they've already, 6 weeks after the budget, changed their forecast. I guess that's better news. Headline, 4.25% rather than 5% is going to be the peak, they reckon. And underlying is a bit more equivocal, but it sounds like better news.
He danced around on that. For the viewers, underlying or core inflation is the one the Reserve Bank looks at when it decides whether or not to increase interest rates. And we had the data out last week for May, I think it was, which showed the Treasurer focused on headline falling, but underlying went up. Core inflation jumped up to 3.6. So, it'd be nice to know what Treasury's forecast is on that.
Yeah, mind you,
irrespective of the markets predicting, the heat's coming out again. I thought that, it's not my expertise, but I thought the view last week was when underlying went up that we might be up for another rate rise this year. But
he's not telling the Reserve Bank what to do, but he is highlighting what the markets are. What the markets are saying.
He thinks inflationary pressures are easing.
Easing.
His own expectations.
Just look at what the market's saying. Maybe that's fair enough. And just on what still needs to be cleaned up from the budget, this so-called widow's tax. Is it clear to you what they're going to do?
Well, he could have been a little bit more forthcoming. So just very quickly, if you had a negatively geared property on budget night, so it's exempt from the changes, that exemption would disappear if it was co-owned by a couple or
someone dies.
Someone dies and the half of the ownership transfers to the other person. That's classified as a change of ownership, so those exemptions disappear. David Pocock's amendments, and I said the Treasurer said it came out in the Senate inquiry. It came out in the Senate inquiry because Pocock asked about it. He unearthed it. I suspect had that not been unearthed, this thing would be finding out about this in a few months.
But it sounds like when he says we're going to fix it.
Yeah, well, Pocock's was the exemption would remain if the transfer of ownership was a result of a family court decision or a death. And it was and the government said, well, we're going to reflect that in the Clean Up on Aisle 9 bill, the second tranche, but the Treasurer wasn't... I think that's what he was saying.
I think that's what he's...
I don't know.
Why would he hesitate to...
Well, perhaps it is because there's detail they're trying to work out, there's other unintended consequences they're trying to work through, they don't want to have knee-jerk reactions, but it still gives that sense that this is happening in real time and to the public that it hasn't been fully formulated. And I think that's a continuing problem for them, that it seems like they're reacting to things others are raising on their own bill. They've pushed through very quickly with a short inquiry. And what else do we not know, or what else might come up?
It's actually law as we speak, because it actually got passed into law. Because Pocock agreed to withdraw his amendment on
so they can do the later piece.
They can do it, and as the Treasurer said, it wouldn't start until July 1 next year, so they have to fix it before then. But we'll keep an eye on it.
Yep, I love the title of the Clean Up on Aisle 9 bill. It's going to stick. On inflation, though, Laura, the Treasurer is obviously pointing to better news when it comes to the interim deal, MOU, whatever we call it, between the US and Iran, and the negotiations are underway. But over the last 48 hours, we've seen a bit of back and forth, strikes on some ships, The US retaliating with a couple of strikes even overnight. There have been more strikes from the US on Iranian targets. I think Donald Trump, I'm just hearing, has been on social media saying
he's going to
more threats.
Yes, and he might be bomb them out of existence or something.
Bomb them out of existence. So he's gone back to pretty extreme
something sort of temperate like that. Yeah.
What's going on?
Look, well, I think there are two things that are happening. One of them is that clearly, the two issues are Strait of Hormuz and Lebanon. And on both of them, they're not going anywhere in a big hurry. I think the disturbing thing about the latest strikes by Iran are that it actually struck an oil tanker, not just a cargo ship in the Strait of Hormuz. So they're flexing their muscles there. But I think so much of this goes back to what's happening in Lebanon. And, of course, Donald Trump is not in control there. They've signed this deal with Israel and the Lebanese government, but Hezbollah sort of said, yeah, well, whatever, guys, we're not going to abide by that. The strikes are continuing. The right-wing parts of the Israeli government are just saying, yeah, whatever, we're staying in Lebanon. It's an existential issue for both Iran and Israel, which is now focused on the northern Israeli, southern Lebanon border. But there's this separate issue, David, which is what is actually happening to the oil market apropos, separate from all of that. And the interesting thing is that, the world economy has not collapsed. It's not great. We've still got inflationary pressures. As the Treasurer said, it's spreading into areas like construction in Australia. But in fact, what's been happening is countries have been very effectively finding different routes to find oil. So you've got to take that into account in looking at what the inflationary outlook is going to be.
Yeah, no, good point. Well, let's turn now to that muddle over multiculturalism and the efforts of both Pauline Hanson and Angus Taylor to explain where they stand.
Do you believe Australia should be a monoculture?
You explain to me what you mean by that. See, there's all these vague words running around. But I tell you what, the one thing I want all of us to share is those core Australian values.
The opposition leader appeared reluctant to endorse the concept.
I've been very clear about what we're committed to. But you haven't.
Oh, look, this is a ridiculous argument. I can't believe that we've managed to get ourselves into this. We are a multicultural society.
My job isn't to give advice to this bloke, but my advice is, how about you stand up to One Nation on something?
After dodging questions...
Do you think Australia should have one culture?
No, but I also think we should have a common set of values we all agree on.
How about you prepared to follow this bloke's leadership and not bend the knee?
Monoculturalism is virtually all you've been able to talk about. It's exactly what I intended.
Who's in the mono? I don't know.
The Socceroos, in fact, represent my vision of a monocultural Australia.
You in the mono? I don't know if I'm in the mono.
Monoculture, plain as one.
Who decides who's in the mono?
We know they're from different cultures, but they went in there to play the game for Australia, and that's what monocultural is.
But Mrs. Hanson, that's what multiculturalism is.
The Australian is reporting this morning that your hesitation to support multiculturalism has got some other Liberal MPs questioning your ability to lead.
I'm not going to comment on anonymous backgrounding, Tom. A multiculturalism that says you can have different rules for different people, that's not what Australia is.
You do a pretty good job.
So, Anna, how on earth did Angus Taylor end up in this position where he was struggling to say whether he supported or even what multiculturalism is?
I think that's a question many of his colleagues are currently asking themselves. I mean, Angus Taylor has put out a statement and he's done media since then saying that he supports a definition of multiculturalism about common values. He says that Labor's definition is different. But from what I've heard from his colleagues, and this is across the spectrum, is that when Angus Taylor can't say that he supports multiculturalism, they believe that there's a message to migrants who come to Australia, many migrants who come to Australia, that he doesn't support them. And that's a big problem as they lead up to the next election. And there's a fear that he's really dancing into a One Nation area, whether it was just a knee-jerk response from him to not be trapped, if that was his thinking. But some of his colleagues are more concerned that there was a deliberative move there not to raise that word, and that Tony Abbott, as president of the Liberal Party, may be influencing where Angus Taylor is going on this issue. So this is a problem for him to go back to his
party room and be able to explain where he's coming from and what he's going to do going forward. A critical week this week, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that Angus Taylor, Phil, wants to prioritise shared values, particularly post-Bondi. We've heard him talk a lot about this. We've got to have more values that we share and abide by and, you know, kick out if you don't follow them. But does that, when he equivocates on multiculturalism, diminish celebrating the differences and diversity that we have?
God, who knows? That was impossible to follow this week. But two things. I mean, I think the bigger picture here is in a week where they had a slow-moving target called a budget that was clearly been pieced together, and that he went out and got in an argument with Pauline Hanson on culture. That was the sort of, I think, the overriding cause of disappointment when, you know, they were making up all this stuff to get the budget across the line. And that's meant to be their salvation, is the budget and the economy, not the cultural issues, as he calls them. But as for whatever message he's trying to send, I don't know. As someone whose grandparents came from a non-English speaking background, you know, my mob came out 100 years ago. It's what they used to call assimilation. It's not that complicated. You sort of come here, you're grateful for the place, you work hard, you assimilate, but that doesn't prevent you from speaking the language at home, you know, having the food, enjoying, you know, celebrating your culture. And, you know, Granddad used to have the pictures of the old country up on the wall. These are not mutually exclusive things, you know, and I don't think it's any more complicated than that. And why they can't actually say it, I don't know, because he's spooked by Hanson. But yeah, I just thought it was that was the thing that stuck out to me is, you know, on the week where they could have been jumping in both feet onto the budget, he got caught in this ridiculous, inexplicable sort of semantic thing that no one could actually work out who was saying.
One Liberal was saying to me, the week that we were celebrating, we were about to have this great campaigning moment against Labor and we were wiped off the map by that press conference. That's how serious they felt.
So and it's not just him, it's the people around him. You've got to anticipate you're going to get this question. And
what are you going to say?
I'm not here to talk about Pauline Hanson, I'm here to talk about the budget. Bang, 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 bang.
Of course I support multiculturalism.
Got to sharpen up.
Are there parallels, Laura, with this debate that's, you know, really dominated over the last week or so, and similar debates in the UK or the US about multiculturalism?
Look, I think the interesting thing about that is in the UK, if you think, I mean, I've just been thinking about this, like in Australia, we had that long period where it was about borders and, you know, people coming in and, you know, on little boats and things. And it's morphed back into where it was when Pauline Hanson first arrived in the Parliament in 1996, which is, I just don't like people who are different, which is threatening to a lot of people. But now it's wound up with a whole range of other issues about, you know, a lot of people who are supporting Pauline Hanson aren't doing it because they're racist. They're doing it because they don't like the system.
They're frustrated.
And they're frustrated. But in terms of the UK and the US, which I think is relevant, the UK, it's a different debate because it is still about people arriving on little boats, and it's about this sense of, you know, a lot of different people arriving, but it's not so tied up in the same way with economic issues as it is here. In the US, if you think about it, it's all about crime. It's basically people are coming in and committing terrible crimes. So there are differences in it, but I think the interesting thing is that you saw in the press club speech from Pauline Hanson that she's importing a lot of the language of the far right in look, both of those places.
Yeah, and not all of it works. She's had to do a bit of a clarification as well, even suggesting the famously multicultural Socceroos are an example of monoculture. But anyway, look, Anna, back to your point about how Liberals are feeling. Clearly, you know, many were rattled after watching Angus Taylor's performance on that this week. And we saw a few stories start to bubble up around leadership questions and so on. I want to show you Andrew Hastie. He emailed his supporters on Friday, and some real fighting words in the email. One nation has declared war on me, so they shall have war. I won't be pushed around by one nation, nor will I bow the knee to them. He went on to say, all this talk of preferences from some people in the Liberal Party is premature. It signals weakness. Just remind us, who's been talking about preferences in the Liberal Party?
Yes, one Angus Taylor, one Tony Abbott. Yeah. And I thought it was interesting when you spoke to Amanda Vanstone about all of this, that she was sort of saying that, you know, Tony Passon's idea of maybe having some kind of agreement about splitting up seats wasn't a bad one, because that one at the time was sort of wiped off pretty quickly.
Well, just on that, it was an interesting chat. It was for the podcast this week, and I wanted to show you this line about leadership. And I did ask her about Angus Taylor, Andrew Hastie, what she thinks, and classic Amanda Vanstone.
If you're going down a dark alley and you're with a couple of blokes, let's just use blokes as an example, and the bogeyman's coming, the person who turns around and says, now look, I'm very intelligent, I'd like to tell you what I think about this bogeyman, and the other guy grabs a, I don't know, baseball bat and says to the bogeyman, piss off, who are you going to go with?
Brilliant. Anyway, interrupted you there, Anna.
No, not at all. I mean...
she certainly has some strong views that, and she was very disappointed at Angus Taylor's handling of the multiculturalism stuff this week.
She was, and I think part of the fear from within the Liberal Party is they don't know how Pauline Hanson's monoculture line has actually landed yet in the realm of the public. They're waiting, in some cases, to see whether or not this is a moment where it's an overstep into an alienation discussion, or whether it is actually something that it's embraced. Pauline Hanson does have, a migrant support base. She has got people who've come from different countries who think that she is speaking sense. But is this now moving them into an area where they're not comfortable and they may look elsewhere to park their vote?
Yeah.
So this is so following them down that path to then discover it's not actually productive to be a voting option is a danger.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there might be some polling out tomorrow. I haven't seen it, but that's going to be really interesting to watch to see if One Nation's vote has come off at all after all of this. We'll see. But the idea of a Liberal leadership change right now, Phil, I mean, he's had a bad week on that front, but would now be the time from...
No, it's not, and those who would trigger such a thing are not interested in it. It's too early, and it's too volatile, and there's too much flux. But it has been spoken about with absolute certainty that there may have to be one
sometime
at the end of this year or into next year if things don't improve. But it is not at the position yet, where someone's about to put the balloon up this week, for example, which is the last sitting week of Parliament before the winter break, which is along with the end of the year, the time when these things are done. So no, but. The concerns are genuine. I mean, Mr. Taylor said earlier this week, one interview he did, because their primary votes at about 20 or 18 or something, and he said, I've stemmed our losses, and that's another way of saying we've hit bedrock. But the fact he's sort of starting to think of these excuses now is that he's clearly feeling the pressure. I mean, they bumped off Susan Lee. They haven't gone anywhere. I think it's the first time I've seen a leadership change where there hasn't been an increase in support. And then at the CEDA conference on Thursday, he sort of made this offhand remark about, I haven't been in politics as long as Pauline Hanson or Anthony Albanese. So he's clearly feels the pressure and he knows he has to lift, and he just doesn't need any more weeks like last week.
A new political party has been born. Allegra Spender and Zali Steggall have joined forces to create Community Strong Australia. Other independents aren't jumping on board just yet. Firstly, on the name, what does everyone think?
It's
Laura?
terrible. It's just terrible. Whatever the idea is, the name is,
I spent a lot of money researching that.
Oh, look, I'm sorry. It's just terrible.
Anyway, how do you think they're going to go? Their whole brand and success has been as independents, and clearly they will have weighed up very carefully what are we going to gain by being part of a party, and we can come to how the rules of how this party works. It is quite different. And what are they going to lose by being part of a party rather than an independent? What do you think? Is it a smart idea?
Look, a couple of things. One of them is a lot of this is about Senate strategy, but basically being able to put a party name above the line so that people can just say, oh yeah, I'm supporting this group. So that might work for them.
Difficult just on that, like David Pocock obviously in the ACT has been very successful in a similar sort of position, but it's a big ask for this new party to win a Senate seat, I would have thought.
It's a huge ask. I suppose you can say, well, they've got to start somewhere. But look, and people are being sort of dissing the whole idea. Clearly, a lot of the independents don't think it's a really good idea. This has been, what they do has been being workshopped for months and months, and it was about loose coalitions to basically coalesce your resources, all those sorts of things. But on the other side, the possibility is that with people being frightened by One Nation on the other side of politics, they want to see some sign of something coalescing that they can support when the Liberal Party is in such a state of complete meltdown.
Yeah. And presumably, I mean, we've seen it in those seats where they have had success. There's an appetite for parties that are a bit more pro-business than Labor, but a bit more or a lot more pro-climate than the Libs.
Yeah, Allegra Spender, I think, sort of managed to articulate it best. She said there's no option at the moment that if you're economically conservative, pro-business, but socially progressive, environmentally aware. There's no option anymore because Labor is no longer economically conservative, and the Liberal Party moderates are who used to sort of hold that mantle on their side on the brink of extinction. So there's no one who it's a bit like the Democrats, you know. That's the way they sort of threaded the way through the middle for about 30 years, so there is an appetite for them, and that's why people voted Teal, I suspect, in a lot of those seats. But it's, as I said before, the intent is one thing, being able to sort of build an empire. And the different
structure here is, and it's kind of holding on to the best bits of being independent, I suppose, while trying to take the best bits of being a party. Everyone will get a free vote. They can vote whichever way they want on everything. There's no leader.
Yeah.
Does that present
That was a media construct, we were told.
Having a party leader. Does that create some difficulties, though, in what are you getting when you vote for this party, if they're all allowed to vote in their own way?
I mean, sure. I mean, this is butting up against what we understand to be the way political parties work, so it's a very different model. But also, there is a public appetite there, the anti-establishment appetite to see, can we do politics a different way? Someone suggested to me that maybe they should have named their party Reason Over Rage, which is sort of their tagline, as a way to sort of more clearly spell out what they are, because Community Strong is not particularly clear in terms of what they're trying to do. But at the same time, I mean, we're 2 years out probably from an election. They've started this process. It does seem diabolically difficult once you actually get to the point of having to make decisions within this very loose structure. I felt there was a little bit of awkwardness between Allegra Spender and Zali Steggall in terms of who would eventually be leader. But at the same time, they're trying something different. And I've chatted to a few pollsters who say, you know, there is a sense of anti-establishment mood, but not necessarily one nation support. There's a softness there. Could some of them then move in a Senate sense to look for another party that's not a major, but feels like they're not voting for a major party?
Well, look, I mean, the political landscape is moving fast and reshaping at the moment. So let's
see.
Speed. Yeah, crowded field. Don't write them off. Let's see how they go. All right, our panel, Anna Henderson, Phil Coorey, Laura Tingle, back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for the New Daily. I'm talking pictures this morning with comedian and director of the Impartial Institute, the one and only Dan Ilic, and a very warm welcome.
Oh, good to be with you, Mike.
Mate, one nation may have one notion about Australian culture, but the coalition's opinions are mixed on the matter.
Yeah, look at this. We've got this great one from Pope here.
Was it an own goal, do you think?
I think this is a reverse own goal.
Right.
I think if you can't say that Australia is multicultural, you can't say that Australia is girt by sea.
It's titled The Keeper, which I thought was terrific. They seem to be throwing water on him like he's some form of beached whale.
Oh, yes, that's what they call it, FIFA now, a hydration break. Yeah.
Lovely Megan Herbert, the big box of Australian values here. What's in it?
And Angus Taylor saying, well, it's more about what's not in it.
What's not in it?
I'd rather not say. I love this, you know, Schrodinger's values. That's what this is.
Yeah.
Interestingly, if Schrodinger came to Australia as a refugee, he probably wouldn't be allowed in.
Take your cat.
Yeah,
go.
Take your cat and go.
Mark Knight has beautifully drawn the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister here as two potential H5N1 victims.
Oh, yes, and we got some hazmat experts up here saying not more cases of bird flu.
Nope, these two are suffering from One Nation polling.
Well, I've always said that Angus Taylor and Albo are unflappable, and here they are.
Here they are.
Very unflappable.
I've heard the term this week, the three right-wing parties coming from the government.
Maybe bird flu will help them grow an extra right wing. Yeah.
Beautiful David Rowe, Dan, the monoculture petri dish with Pauline Carl and little Tommy Robinson.
I love this. Look at the scientists saying, F, it's mutating.
Yeah. Isn't when a virus mutates, doesn't it kill the host?
Oh, true, it does.
Yeah, so
and the host is Carl Stefanovic. He's gone.
He's gone. Late on Thursday, the tax laws amendments passed. There was just this moment when Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, and the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was walking out.
A gentle pat on the back.
Gentle pat on the back.
I noticed there's no knife in Jim Chalmers' hand. That's unusual, isn't it, for a Treasurer?
It was definitely knifeless. Dan, they say a week is a long time in politics, but 10 years seems to be a short time to have 6 British Prime Ministers.
Yeah, I think the UK's caught Australianitis.
Yeah. Mark Knight has drawn the revolving door here at number 10 Downing Street with Keir Starmer Starmer being ejected through the door, and I guess this is Andy
Burnham going in. Yeah, at least this is better than the Liberal Party. They've got a revolting door.
Yeah. They've got a devolving door.
A devolving door.
Lovely Cathy Wilcox. PM demonstrates the danger of standing in the middle of the road.
We got Nigel Farage. Is he driving a garbage truck head on into Keir Starmer?
Might be the NHS bus. And Johannes has picked up on this beautifully. They do actually look fairly similar, don't they?
They absolutely do. Here we go. We've got Burnham saying people are crying out for real change, not just more of the same.
And as the Starmer poster's being replaced.
Burnham is what you get if you ask ChatGPT for a picture of Keir Starmer. And if you ask Google Gemini, you get Dan Andrews. And if you ask Siri, you get Albo.
which brings us to Albo having his morning brekkie here from Fiona Katauskas at the Lodge, and he's listening to the news.
Despite being elected with a historic majority, the Labour leader became increasingly unpopular due to his perceived lack of political courage and global economic mess and the rise of far-right populism.
He's,
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
Is that me?
He's choking on Weet-Bix there.
Yeah.
I think only one of these three things that actually Albo can change, but it depends on the size of his stimulus package.
Yeah, we don't talk about the size of people's stimulus package here.
I'm sorry to be so sizist.
Dan, it's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week, and I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Anna.
Vanuatu's Prime Minister Jotham Napat will be here tomorrow, and we're expecting that Nakamal agreement between the two countries could finally be concluded.
This was the on again, off again, on again.
There's been a few flights around the region which have been left with empty hands, but now it looks like there is a deal on that front that will push back against China in terms of critical infrastructure, foreign bases. It'll be interesting to see, the detail of that agreement, but a really significant moment for Pacific diplomacy for the government.
Yeah, and look, they've made a point, haven't they, of more and more of these agreements in the Pacific when it comes to that Pacific diplomacy. So that'll be interesting to see the detail tomorrow. Phil?
Well, nothing impressive, but just the
talk it up.
We did see the talking about the passage of the budget bill this week, and the government hopes it all goes away. But there's still two large pieces to come. We've got that second bill we've been talking about to clean up all the unintended consequences.
The Isle 9 bill.
Then we start on trusts. The changes to trust, and there's 360,000 businesses legally and legitimately structured through trust who may have to restructure. So if they, we may not have heard the last of this budget yet, especially from the small business perspective. So it's, I think it's going to be a long year in that.
And the NDIS bill, for what it's worth, they plan to pass that through the lower house this week and then off to the Senate for the.
And that'll go through in August. That deals
with the coalition, you would think. Laura.
Phil Coorey used to call me Miss Yesteryear when we shared an office in the Financial Review, and I've been thinking a lot about what's changed since Pauline Hanson first appeared on the scene in 1996, and now, and the term monoculture rang a bit of a bell. And there's a speech by one Paul Keating after he'd left office in 1996, after he'd been voted out, which talked in part about that. And he says the great tragedy of the shamelessly regressive politics of Pauline Hanson is not, I'm going to edit it down, but he says it's the myth of the monoculture, the lie that we can retreat to it. And he makes the point that this all arose partly because people were frightened by globalisation and threatened by its impact. But his argument is our integration with the rest of the world has made more than the streets and the arts and the food more interesting. It's created new opportunities in agriculture and horticulture, tourism and hospitality, education, manufacturing, retailing, science, arts and entertainment. It has changed the nature of work and workplaces, and if there's a general hankering to go back to the old ones, it can only be because a lot of people have forgotten what they were like. And he ultimately puts the pressure on, not Pauline Hanson. He says you can always find a Pauline Hanson to attack multiculturalism, but the fact is it's the responsibility of governments to protect the national interest against the tide of prejudice. And if multiculturalism and a multicultural Australia are going to continue, or if it's going to fall over, it'll be because the government has stopped peddling. So, slightly long observation. And on indulgence from your executive producer, Spearsy, I'd just been like to mention to voters that if you're interested in voting,
all right.
there's a QR code here where you can vote for David Speers as most popular.
Well, thank you.
And you did a great job on Home and Away as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Is there one for the panellists?
Do we all get to go?
We all get to share.
One's easy for the Logies.
All right, thank you, and thank you to the executive producer and the team for embarrassing me at the end of the program. Thank you all. Thanks. No, really, genuinely appreciate it. Thanks for joining us this morning. Finally, British Labor MPs are pinning their hopes on Andy Burnham to turn their fortunes around, defeat populism, put the country back on track, create a template for other centre-left parties around the world. But can he do all that? Well, probably a good idea to manage expectations. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
We now come to Andy Burnham, member for Makerfield.
Road me say.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.